What if I told you that one man, born on the small island of Corsica, would rise to command the destiny of Europe? This isn't a fantasy novel. It's the real-life story of Napoleon Bonaparte, a name that echoes through history as both a genius and a tyrant. Was he the brilliant strategist who brought order, modern law, and a bold new vision to a continent shattered by revolution? Or was he simply a relentless conqueror whose insatiable hunger for power left millions dead and nations in ruin? It's one of history's greatest debates, and the answer is far from simple. Today, we're diving deep into the paradox of Napoleon, the soldier who became an emperor, the hero who became a villain, and the exile who became an immortal legend. His story isn't just about epic battles and sprawling empires. It's about raw ambition, the corrupting nature of power, and the ultimate price of greatness. So, stick with us as we unravel the man behind the myth. To understand the man, you have to understand the times. Late 18th century France was a whirlwind of chaos. The French Revolution had torn the country apart. The Reign of Terror saw heads rolling, literally, and the government was a mess of corruption and instability. People were desperate for a leader, for someone who could restore order and national pride. And out of this chaos, a young, ambitious artillery officer from Corsica saw his chance. Napoleon wasn't born into French high society. In fact, he was often mocked for his Corsican accent and modest background. But what he lacked in noble blood, he more than made up for in sheer talent and ruthless determination. His military genius was undeniable. At the siege of Toulon in 1793, at just 24 years old, he masterminded a plan that recaptured the city from British forces. Suddenly, everyone in Paris was asking, "Who is this Bonaparte?" His star rose meteorically. He led dazzling campaigns in Italy, turning a poorly supplied army into an unstoppable force. His dispatches from the front lines were masterpieces of propaganda, painting him as a savior of the Republic. He knew how to craft his own image, a skill just as important as his battlefield tactics. He wasn't just winning wars, he was winning hearts and minds. But even then there were signs of his immense ego. His campaign in Egypt, while famous for the discovery of the Rosetta Stone, was a military disaster. Yet Napoleon spun it as a triumph, abandoning his army to rush back to Paris, where political power was up for grabs. In 1799, he seized it. In a bold move known as the coup of Aidin-Brumaire, Napoleon overthrew the failing government and established himself as first consul of France. He promised peace, stability, and an end to the revolutionary chaos. And for a while, he delivered. This is where we see the hero side of Napoleon shine brightest. He wasn't just a general, he was a remarkable administrator. His most enduring legacy is arguably the Napoleonic Code. Before him, French law was a tangled, confusing mess of old feudal rules and local customs. Napoleon brought together the best legal minds to create a single, unified legal code for the entire country. It enshrined principles like equality before the law, freedom of religion, and the protection of private property. It was so revolutionary and effective that it was adopted, in whole or in part, by dozens of countries around the world, and its influence is still felt in legal systems today. Think about that. A law code created over 200 years ago still shapes how justice works in places from Europe to Latin America. He also reformed France's economy, establishing the Bank of France to stabilize the nation's finances. He built new roads, bridges, and canals, boosting trade and unifying the country. He centralized the government, creating a system of prefects to administer regions, a system that largely still exists in France. He also overhauled the education system, establishing the Seen Lycées high schools to train the nation's future leaders based on merit, not birth. For the average French citizen tired of a decade of turmoil, Napoleon looked like a savior. He brought order, prosperity, and glory back to France. But power, as we know, corrupts. The man who was once a hero of the Republic slowly began to look more like the monarchs he had replaced. In 1804, he made his most audacious move yet. In the grand Notre Dame Cathedral, with the Pope present, Napoleon took the crown and placed it on his own head, declaring himself Emperor of the French. He wasn't chosen by God or by bloodline. He chose himself. This act symbolized his ultimate belief in his own destiny. The soldier of the revolution was now an absolute ruler. And this is where the story darkens. As emperor, Napoleon's ambition knew no bounds. He believed it was his destiny to unite Europe under his command, with France at its heart. This led to a series of conflicts known as the Napoleonic Wars, which engulfed the continent for over a decade. His military brilliance continued to shine. Victories like the one at Austerlitz in 1805, known as the Battle of the Three Empires, are still studied in military academies today as textbook examples of strategic genius. He redrew the map of Europe, placing his relatives and loyal marshals on the thrones of conquered nations. For a time, it seemed like nothing could stop him, but his conquests came at a horrific human cost. It's estimated that the Napoleonic Wars caused the deaths of 3 to 6 million people, both soldiers and civilians. His relentless conscription drained France of its young men. His continental system, an attempt to wage economic war by blocking all trade with Britain, ended up hurting the European economy far more than it hurt the British. Nations under his rule grew to resent French domination and the heavy taxes imposed on them. The seeds of nationalism he inadvertently sowed in Spain, Germany, and Russia would eventually grow into powerful resistance movements that would be his undoing. The turning point was his catastrophic invasion of Russia in 1812. Convinced he could force Tsar Alexander I to submit, Napoleon led the Grande Armée, a force of over 500,000 men, deep into Russia. But the Russians refused to engage in a decisive battle. Instead, they retreated, burning their own villages and crops, employing a scorched earth policy. When Napoleon finally reached Moscow, he found a deserted, burning city. With no supplies and winter setting in, the retreat became one of the greatest military disasters in history. Starvation, the brutal Russian winter, and relentless Cossack raids decimated his army. Of the more than 500,000 men who invaded, fewer than 100,000 made it back. The myth of Napoleon's invincibility was shattered. Emboldened by his defeat, a coalition of European powers, Britain, Russia, Prussia, and Austria, rose up against him. They cornered him at the Battle of Leipzig in 1813, the Battle of Nations, and inflicted a crushing defeat. The Allies invaded France. And in 1814, Napoleon was forced to abdicate. His enemies exiled him to the tiny island of Elba in the Mediterranean. They thought they were rid of him. They were wrong. Less than a year later, in a move of unbelievable audacity, Napoleon escaped. He landed in France with a handful of followers and began a march to Paris. The king sent an army to intercept him. Napoleon walked out alone, faced the soldiers, and famously said, "Soldiers of the 5th Regiment, if there is one among you who would kill his emperor, here I am." The soldiers, many of whom had fought under him, threw down their weapons and shouted, "Vive l'Empereur!" His return to power, known as the 100 Days, was a testament to the incredible loyalty he still commanded. But the rest of Europe was not going to let him reign again. They quickly assembled another coalition. The final showdown came in June 1815, at a small Belgian village called Waterloo. It was a close, brutal battle, but ultimately Napoleon was defeated for the last time. This time, his captors took no chances. They exiled him to St. Helena, a remote, windswept rock in the middle of the South Atlantic, thousands of miles from anywhere. It was there, under Constant Bridisgar, that he spent the last 6 years of his life, dictating his memoirs and cementing his own legend before dying in 1821. So, after all that, what is his legacy? Hero or villain? The truth is, he was both. He was a progressive reformer whose legal code champions equality, and a brutal dictator whose wars killed millions. He was a meritocratic leader who promoted talent over birthright, and a nepotist who placed his family on thrones. He spread the ideals of the French Revolution, equality and fraternity across Europe, often at the point of a bayonet. He was a modernizer and a tyrant, a genius and a gambler whose final bet cost him everything. Perhaps the best way to see Napoleon is not as a hero or a villain, but as a force of nature, a human whirlwind that tore down an old world and, in its place, laid the foundations for a new one. His story is a powerful, timeless warning about the dazzling allure of power and the terrifying heights of human ambition. He remains one of history's most fascinating and complex figures, a man who, for a brief, brilliant moment, held the world in his hands. What do you think? Was Napoleon a great man who was corrupted by power, or was his tyranny inevitable from the start? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and if you enjoyed this journey into history, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell for more. See you next time.